Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime. The rain is tapping a frantic rhythm against the single tall window of my room, mimicking the sound I always associate with late-night study sessions in the library annex. The sound of history being revised, perhaps, or maybe just erased. The old fluorescent light above my desk is buzzing, a thin, high-pitched whine that seems to vibrate the very air around me, making the shadows shift and deepen in the corners. It smells like old paper and cold, damp stone. That distinct scent is always stronger after midnight in a place like this, when the heating cuts out and the building settles back into its natural, quiet dread. Tonight, the story isn't about a standard ghost in the mirror or a bloody signature in the basement. This story is about something quieter, something that burrowed deep into the curriculum and started rewriting our lives in blue ink. It's about the terrifying realization that some lessons were never meant to be taught, and some histories haven't happened yet. You probably won't make it to morning after this one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in the comments below. We're all locked into the same late hour now, sharing this quiet corridor of fear. Now, dim the lights, maybe crack open a window for that midnight breeze, and let's walk the halls together. It all started the day Mr. Sterling walked into room 212. Our regular histories teacher, Mrs. Albright, had vanished without even a faculty announcement. A quiet removal, the kind that feeds the locker-side rumors for weeks. She was replaced by a man who seemed constructed entirely out of outdated textbooks and dust motes. Mr. Sterling wore thick tweed jackets that smelled faintly of mothballs, even in October, and his presence made the air in the already stuffy classroom feel colder, heavier. Room 212 was already a place steeped in uncomfortable tradition. It was tucked away at the end of the second-floor north wing, right next to the sealed-off emergency stairwell. A relic of a 1950s fire code violation that local rumor insisted was sealed because of the third-floor shadow, a distortion that supposedly haunted the landing, consuming anyone who looked too closely into its reflection. I'd always dismissed it as classic high school myth-making, just an excuse for the janitors to ignore that dusty corridor. Mr. Sterling didn't even bother taking attendance on his first day. He walked straight to the chalkboard, and with a scraping sound that made my teeth ache, he wrote, in sprawling, elegant cursive, unwritten histories. History, he announced, turning to face us, his eyes magnified behind thick spectacles, is merely a record of what was. But to truly understand the nature of time and consequence, you must learn to document what will be. The class exchanged puzzled glances. Was this some kind of philosophy elective masquerading as U.S. history? Your first assignment, he continued, pulling a stack of heavy, unlined parchment paper from his briefcase. Not the standard line notebook paper the school issued, but thick, cream-colored sheets that felt rough and cold to the touch, is to write an essay detailing an event that has not yet occurred. It must be a specific, verifiable incident set within the confines of this school, and it must occur within the next 48 hours. A low murmur rippled through the desks. Someone coughed nervously. What do you mean, detail an event? Mark, sitting in the front row, asked, confusion etched across his face. Like a prediction? A document, Mr. Sterling corrected, emphasizing the word sharply. I require forensic specificity. Date, time, location, actors involved, dialogue, ambient conditions. The humidity, the temperature, the exact color of the light. Write it as if you are the observer, recording it moments after the event concluded. You are not to speculate. You are to record. The parameters of the assignment were baffling, but Sterling's intensity was mesmerizing. He wasn't grading us on accuracy. He was grading us on detail. He handed out the parchment. It smelled faintly of something metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. Most of the students treated it like a creative writing prompt. Maria wrote about winning the lottery. Alex wrote about the cafeteria serving real steak and lobster for lunch, a clear act of defiance against the school budget. I, however, found myself drawn to the quiet, mechanical heart of the school, the PA system. I chose a specific, small detail, wanting to push the boundaries of the request without inviting disaster. I wrote, November 4th, 3:15 p.m. Location, second floor, hallway A, near the art room. The custodial crew will be performing routine maintenance on the main announcement speakers. Due to a wiring error caused by dust buildup, the system will briefly broadcast the music from the principal's personal collection, specifically the opening bars of the 1980s ballad, The Sound of Silence, before cutting out with a sharp, static hiss. The resulting silence will be immediate and absolute. It was harmless. It was detailed. It was exactly 142 words, and I used the word hiss twice. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and mild foolishness as I turned the thick paper in. Mr. Sterling collected them with a silent, almost reverent gesture, stacking them meticulously on his podium. "Excellent work, class," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over us, seeming to settle on the exact point behind my head. The future, I find, is usually eager to be written. Class dismissed. As I walked out into the humming hallway, I noticed something else strange about Mr. Sterling's room. Room 212 had always been known for its terrible clock. It ran consistently 5 minutes fast. But today, as I glanced up, the old electric clock above the door wasn't just fast. It was cycling backward. The minute hand was twitching counterclockwise, stuttering every few seconds before reversing course again. It felt like the classroom itself was rejecting the forward flow of time. I mentioned it to my friend, Liam, who just shrugged. The history department is always broken, man. Probably just needs a new battery. But Mr. Sterling didn't use batteries. He used the future. The moment the true weight of the assignment settled on me wasn't immediate. It was a slow, creeping dread, like watching a crack in the ceiling expand centimeter by centimeter. I tried to forget about the essay, focusing instead on the geometry homework and the relentless squeak of my shoes on the polished linoleum. The next day passed normally until 3:10 p.m. I was putting away my supplies in my locker, which was conveniently located near the art room, just as I had described in my essay. The bell had rung, and the hallway was thinning out as students rushed for the buses. I heard the sound first, a faint clatter near the ceiling panel where the PA speakers were housed. It was the distinct sound of a wrench hitting metal, followed by muffled cursing, confirming the custodial maintenance. I froze. 3:15 p.m. I told myself it was coincidence. Custodians clean. Speakers break. It was just a highly detailed guess. Then, precisely as my phone screen illuminated to show 3:15 p.m., the PA system crackled to life. It didn't start with the usual static burst. It started mid-song, a familiar, synthesizer-heavy melody. It was definitely an 80s ballad, and I recognized the echoing drums instantly. "Hello, Darkness, my old friend." It was Simon and Garfunkel's The Sound of Silence, though I knew the principal preferred the disturbed cover, which was far less eerie. It was the original version, tinny and melancholic, blasting across the deserted second floor. My heart hammered against my ribs. My essay had specified the opening bars of the song. Just as the lyric, "I've come to talk with you again," echoed, the music sliced off abruptly. not fading, not skipping, but terminated by a sharp, violent hiss of static, a sound that seemed to suck the very air out of the hallway. The subsequent silence was not merely the absence of noise. It was heavy, suffocating, exactly as I had written. A custodian poked his head out of the art room, holding a frayed length of wire, looking bewildered. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, checking his walkie-talkie. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I slammed my locker shut, the sound echoing too loud in the sudden, absolute silence of the hall. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't predicted the event. I had authored it. I walked faster, my curiosity dissolving into a rising tide of fear. The assignment wasn't about understanding history. It was about weaponizing the future. And Mr. Sterling knew exactly what he was doing when he passed out that blood-smelling paper. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially not the ones that hand you the pen and tell you to write the next chapter of the world. I needed to know what the other students had written, and more terrifyingly, what Sterling planned to do with all those freshly written, terrifyingly specific futures stacked on his podium. The next day, Room 212 felt less like a classroom and more like an incubator for reality. Everyone was jumpy. Mark kept checking his pocket, nervously patting the space where he usually kept his phone. Sarah, who had written about the vending machine spitting out gold coins, kept staring intently at the lobby machine, willing it to confirm her bizarre assignment. The air was thick with the silent realization that our words had consequence, that the act of writing was not interpretation, but creation. I was operating on pure adrenaline and cold logic. My essay about the PA system was small, localized, and easily dismissed as coincidence by anyone who hadn't written it. But I knew the truth, and the metallic tang of the parchment paper still seemed to cling to my fingertips. When Mr. Sterling walked in, he offered no critique, no praise. He simply stared at us, a faint, almost satisfied smile playing on his lips. "We move forward," he said, his voice dry as aged paper. "The assignment for this week is broader. Detail an emotional consequence. Write about the despair, the fear, or the quiet, absolute relief that follows an event of local significance. Again, 48 hours. Again, forensic detail." But before he could distribute the new parchment, Liam shot his hand up. Liam was never brave. He was driven by panic. "Mr. Sterling," Liam stammered, his face pale. "I wrote about the main flagpole snapping and hitting the principal's car, totaled. I was joking, sir. But this morning, there was an announcement, a sudden emergency maintenance closure of the front parking lot. They said structural instability near the flag. Is this real?" Mr. Sterling leaned forward, resting his bony hands on the podium. The light from the single window caught the dust motes dancing around his head, giving him a weird, spectral halo. "Did you document the event, Mr. Davies?" "Yes, sir. I wrote that the pole would snap at 7:55 a.m. during the first bell due to a rogue gust of wind, and that it would land precisely on the hood ornament of the 2008 Corolla parked closest to the entrance. It was a joke. And what time did the announcement for structural instability occur?" Liam swallowed hard. 7:50 a.m. They evacuated the lot just before 7:55. Mr. Sterling gave a slight nod. "Then you have witnessed the administrative intervention preceding an anticipated event. The school board, in its infinite wisdom, attempted to prevent the history you documented. They merely delayed the consequence, not the cause. You see, the events are immutable once written. They may shift in time or location, but the core truth, the flagpole snapping, the Corolla's destruction, is locked in. I suggest you observe the maintenance crew closely, Mr. Davies. Liam didn't write another word that week. He sat slumped at his desk, staring out the window, occasionally flinching as if expecting a sudden, terrifying announcement over the PA system. That same faint, humming sound that seemed to carry static and dread now. I felt a cold dread wrapping around my throat. If Liam's silly fictional prediction about a flagpole, a destructive event, was so real that the administration had to preemptively shut down the parking lot, then what kind of reality were we drafting for the school? I needed to see the records. Not the essays the students wrote, but the history of room 212 itself. The school library, a vast, echoing cavern constructed in the brutalist style of the late 60s, was my natural habitat. It was the only place in the school complex built with its own internal gravity, pulling silence inward. It also held the school archives, tucked away in the back reference section on a small, elevated balcony accessible only by a rattling, old spiral stairwell. That evening, I stayed late. I told Mrs. Peterson, the librarian, that I was working on a major research project for a scholarship. She just nodded, her attention fixed on an ancient CRT monitor, ignoring the fluorescent tubes that were flickering relentlessly overhead. I climbed the iron stairwell. It smelled like oxidation and forgotten years. The balcony was dark and dusty, containing microfilm newspapers and stacks of old, oversized yearbooks stretching back to the school's founding in 1948. I pulled out the archives for the 1980s, knowing that Mr. Sterling's appearance felt profoundly anachronistic, like he'd stepped straight out of a decade known for strange absences and moral panics. My realistic anchor for this section was the library's physical layout, specifically the spiral stairwell leading to the archives, a place where real school history was kept. As I searched, I realized the supernatural element was already in play, the written word manifesting. I needed to connect Sterling to the past, and I needed it now. I found it in the 1987 yearbook, tucked behind a binder of old student council minutes. The yearbook was open to a page documenting the history club. In the photo, a student with ridiculously high hair and a nervous grin looked directly at the camera. His name was Peter Crowley. Beneath the photo, someone, not the yearbook editors, the handwriting was too hurried, too specific, had scrawled a note in faded blue ink. Missing since October 1987. Last seen in room 212. Wrote about the rain. Rain. A simple observation, yet terrifying in this new context. I flipped through the 1987 history class roster. Peter Crowley was listed. I searched the administrative records binder for the same year and found something chilling. A disciplinary file opened and immediately closed concerning a student named Crowley, Peter. The file was empty except for a single, heavy sheet of cream-colored parchment paper, folded once. It was identical to the paper Mr. Sterling had given us. It even had that faint metallic smell. I unfolded it, my hands shaking so badly I almost tore the brittle edges. It was an essay, written in shaky cursive. The handwriting matched the scrawl beneath the yearbook picture. October 29th, 1987. Location: the main library reference balcony, near the microfiche readers. A profound silence will fall over the school at 8 p.m. I will be researching my disappearance. I will discover the truth in the archives, but the discovery itself will erase the previous version of me. The rain will be heavy, making the noise of the drain pipes sound like weeping. The last thing I hear is the creak of the spiral stairwell behind me, closing off my return. It was a first-person account of his own disappearance. It wasn't a warning, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Peter Crowley hadn't been researching a historical event. He had been writing his own demise, compelled by the same curriculum. The clock in the main library downstairs chimed a deep, resonant 8 times. The same hour Crowley had detailed. Outside the tall library windows, the rain, which had been a gentle mist, suddenly intensified, slamming against the glass like thrown gravel. The noise of the drain pipes immediately changed pitch, becoming a mournful, drawn-out groan that sounded exactly, terrifyingly, like weeping. I was standing exactly where he had documented the event, the reference balcony. The profound silence he wrote about descended not over the school, but over the library itself. Mrs. Peterson's typing stopped. The fluorescent hum seemed to pause. The only sound was the rain and my own ragged breathing. Then, the spiral stairwell, the heavy iron structure that led down to the main floor, let out a deep, tortured creak. The sound of weight shifting on the oldest part of the frame, the sound of something large and heavy ascending, or perhaps descending, and definitely closing off my only exit. I froze, pressed against the dusty shelves. Curiosity had certainly faded. This was pure, absolute fear. I hadn't authored this history, but I was witnessing the evidence of its terrifying effectiveness. I think some history lessons were never meant to be taught. The revelation struck me cold. Mr. Sterling wasn't a history teacher. He was an editor. He wasn't collecting creative writing. He was compiling a new reality for this building, and he needed the specificity of our teenage minds, our raw, undirected fear and hope, to write it into existence. Peter Crowley had written his own end, and now I was standing in the resulting silence, holding the evidence of the paradoxical trap. I didn't wait for the sound on the stairwell to materialize into a visible shape. I folded Peter's essay and tucked it inside my history textbook. Then, moving with the practiced quiet of a ghost, I descended the stairs quickly, avoiding the precise step that had creaked, and fled the library, running past Mrs. Peterson, who was now just staring blankly at the dark window, as if something vital had just been pulled from the room's atmosphere. The metallic scent of the parchment followed me into the night air. The next morning, the school felt fundamentally altered. The linoleum floors shone too brightly, the air conditioning hummed too loudly, and every shadow seemed dense with implied menace. I walked the halls with Peter Crowley's disappearance essay tucked securely inside my copy of A People's History, its presence a heavy weight of guilt and dread. I couldn't look at any of my classmates without wondering what horrific details they had penned, what minor vandalism, what catastrophic failure, what emotional collapse they had unwittingly pre-authored. The escalation was palpable. Yesterday, a flagpole was nearly involved in an accident. Today, Maria, who had written about winning the lottery, came into class teary-eyed. She hadn't won any money. Instead, her grandfather, a retired postal worker, had won a large sum, causing an immediate, vicious fight between Maria's previously amiable parents over how the windfall should be managed. Maria hadn't written about her family breaking apart. She had written about the source of the fracture, the sudden, massive financial shift. Mr. Sterling's requirement for emotional consequence was coming due, and the reality was warping the details to fit the tone. When I entered room 212, Mr. Sterling was already there, meticulously sorting through a new batch of essays. He glanced up as I approached, and his gaze seemed to drill right into the history textbook I clutched. "Mr. Thorne," he addressed me, his voice a low whisper that somehow cut through the class chatter. "I trust your observation skills are sharpening." I stopped at his podium, my heart pounding a panicked drumbeat against my ribs. "Sir, about the assignments." "The assignments," he interrupted, picking up a pen with thin, skeletal fingers, "are merely a tool for focus. You teenagers possess an energy, a vibrant, chaotic stream of potential that most adults lose to tedium. We harness that potential. We give it direction. I leaned in, lowering my voice. Peter Crowley, 1987. Did you give him the same assignment? Sterling didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the name directly. He just tapped the corner of the textbook. The paper, Mr. Thorne, is always the same. Cream-colored. Imported from a facility that respects the delicate structure of temporal ink. It is a conduit, not merely a surface. He was confirming it. He was a caretaker of this horrific tradition. Crowley wrote about his own disappearance. I pushed, feeling the reckless surge of confronting the truth. He documented himself vanishing from the archives. Why? Why does an artist paint their own still life? To capture the moment of truth, Sterling replied, a cryptic half-smile twisting his mouth. Peter was a student of immense potential, but he lacked control. He feared the future, and so, when asked to document it, he documented his greatest fear, erasure. He wrote himself out of existence. He saw the spiral stairwell closing off his return. A profound, self-authored paradox. The paradox was the key. We weren't predicting, we were sealing the fate. The moment the words were finalized on the parchment, the reality scrambled backward to accommodate them, making the event inevitable. This terrifying realization connected the three beats. My initial curiosity about Sterling, the fear when the PA system played, and now the horrific revelation about the paradoxical nature of the writing. Mr. Sterling distributed the new paper. The task was now focused on sound. Your next documentation, he announced, his voice carrying an unusual authority, must detail a sound that will define the next 48 hours of this building's operation. A specific, ambient auditory detail. The sound of despair, or perhaps the sound of release. I knew I couldn't write anything harmless this time. Any small prediction I made now had the potential to fracture reality in a bigger, more destructive way, especially since Liam's flagpole prediction was still pending a final resolution. I looked around the room. Alex, the cafeteria joker, was chewing his pen, looking strained. Maria was openly weeping now, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue, the emotional consequence of her written lottery manifesting brutally. We were all trapped in a feedback loop. The realistic anchor I clung to was the school's physical structure, the basement. It wasn't just a mythic location. It was where the main mechanical systems were housed, prone to noise, vibrations, and frequent minor failures. I decided I had to intervene, not by writing a hopeful outcome, but by documenting an event that would expose Sterling in this process without causing mass panic. I needed a sound that was impossible to ignore, but also impossible to fully verify as catastrophic. I thought about the mythic element, the haunted PA system, always humming with that faint static. I started writing, meticulously crafting a specific auditory event tied to the heart of the building, the old steam pipes running through the basement. November 6th, 1:47 a.m. Location, main basement level, beneath the principal's office. An internal rupture in the oldest section of the main steam line, installed 1961, will occur. The pressure release will not be heard as a boom, but as a continuous, high-pitched, harmonic scream, lasting precisely 47 seconds. This sound will travel through the vents and ductwork, echoing through the empty halls, and causing the glass in the emergency stairwell windows to vibrate at a dangerous frequency. It will sound exactly like a chorus of terrified voices, muffled by stone. I specified 1:47 a.m., a time when only the night security guard and the school itself would be present. The goal was to terrify Sterling and disrupt the status quo without involving students directly. I signed my essay and walked up to the podium. As I placed it on the stack, my eyes fell on the top essay, written in a spidery, unsettling hand. It wasn't one of the students. It was another sheet of cream-colored parchment, clearly marked, Mr. Sterling, teacher. He hadn't written a documentation for us to fulfill. He had written his own. The title was stark, the final announcement. I didn't dare read the content, but the revelation was immediate and terrifying. Mr. Sterling wasn't just the editor. He was the primary author of this ongoing narrative. And if he was asking us to write about sound, it was because his own documentation, the final announcement, was about to be broadcast. He was setting the stage for his own conclusion, using our essays as the atmospheric details, the sound effects and lighting cues for his grand exit. "You look troubled, Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, watching me with unnerving intensity. "I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, Mr. Sterling, and some authors should stop writing before the final chapter." On the contrary, he smiled, a genuine, skeletal expression. "The final chapter is the only one worth documenting. It is the moment when all paradoxes resolve. Class dismissed. Be mindful of the night. Things are often louder when no one is listening." I left room 212, feeling the clock above the door vibrating the same unnatural, reversing energy. My self-authored scream, Peter Crowley's erased history, Liam's inevitable flagpole collapse, and Sterling's terrifying final announcement were all converging. I had sealed the basement's fate, setting the sound for a midnight catastrophe. The school was a pressure cooker, and Sterling was about to lift the lid. The wait for 1:47 a.m. was excruciating. Time felt stretchy and thin, like the skin of a drum pulled too tight. Every ticking clock, every closing locker, every distant police siren felt like a countdown to the screaming silence I had documented. I couldn't go home. I felt compelled to stay, to witness the reality I had forged, and to try and intercept whatever terrible script Mr. Sterling was preparing for the school with his final announcement. I convinced Liam, who was still visibly traumatized by the pending fate of the flagpole, to wait with me. We hid in the dusty choir practice room on the first floor, a location close enough to hear the basement vents, but far enough from the administration wing to remain unnoticed by the lone night security guard, Mr. Vance. "What if we just burn the essays?" Liam whispered, huddled in the dark room, surrounded by silent music stands and the faint smell of old sheet music. "It doesn't work that way," I replied, running a hand over the cold, rough concrete wall. "Peter Crowley's disappearance was sealed 30 years ago. The writing isn't the event, it's the catalyst. Once it's documented, reality adjusts around the outcome. If we burn the paper now, we just eliminate the evidence of how it happened, not the fact that it will." The reality anchor I needed now was the school's constant, low-frequency soundscape, the hum of the old boiler system, the background noise that tells you a building is alive. We listened to the endless hum of the ventilation system. It was the mechanical heartbeat of the school, but tonight, it seemed erratic, occasionally skipping a beat or grinding with unnatural effort, as if struggling against the conflicting narratives we had imposed upon it. Around 1 a.m., the lights flickered in the choir room. Not a standard brownout, but a specific, staccato series of flashes that made the shadows jump and writhe like panicked animals. Liam gasped. "What was that?" "Sterling setting the mood," I muttered, checking my phone. The digital clock read 1:03 a.m. I needed to understand the paradox better. I opened Peter Crowley's essay again, reading the words that had written him out of existence. I will be researching my disappearance. I will discover the truth in the archives, but the discovery itself will erase the previous version of me. The writing creates the history, but the history necessitates the writing. Which comes first? It was an Ouroboros of dread. By documenting the future, we weren't changing history. We were creating it, binding ourselves to its inevitable conclusion. I realized then why Sterling needed teenagers. Our minds are still pliable, capable of believing impossible things, and our words carry an unburdened specificity that adults lose. We were instruments of creation, drafting the school's final narrative. I heard footsteps outside the choir room. Slow, shuffling, hesitant footsteps, punctuated by the faint jingle of keys. Mr. Vance, the security guard, making his rounds. He stopped right outside our door. Liam froze, holding his breath. I could hear the faint squeak of Vance's old rubber soles on the linoleum. Then, from the PA system, which was supposed to be silent at night, came a thin, horrifying sound. It wasn't the 1980s ballad from my earlier essay. It was pure static, but modulated. It sounded like someone attempting to shape white noise into words. It was the mythic element, the haunted PA system, broadcasting Sterling's preparations. "This is it," I whispered. The final announcement. The modulated static suddenly coalesced into a single, dry, amplified voice. Sterling's voice, though distorted and echoing, as if being broadcast from a vast, empty canyon. "Attention, students of the future," the voice crackled. "The lesson is concluding. Time is an unreliable narrator. The structure requires rest." The footsteps outside stopped completely. Mr. Vance was listening. "The greatest tragedy," Sterling's voice continued, gaining clarity, "is not the end, but the refusal to document it. Embrace the narrative closure." He was speaking in riddles, yet the menace was terrifyingly clear. He was preparing the school for a narrative closure, an ending. The sound of the high-pitched, harmonic scream from the basement ruptured the silence at 1:47 a.m. precisely. It wasn't a metallic screech or a whistle. It was exactly as I had documented, a high-frequency, mournful sound traveling through the ventilation ducts, filling the entire school structure. It was the sound of a steam line rupture, but transposed, amplified, resonating through the concrete like trapped human grief. It sounded like hundreds of voices screaming in unison, muffled by rock and earth, desperate and unending. Liam clapped his hands over his ears, his eyes wide with horror. "Make it stop." The sound lasted precisely 47 seconds, vibrating the dust on the piano in the choir room. It was physically painful, a sound that felt less heard and more felt in the bones. When it cut out, the resulting silence was so profound it felt like the school had inhaled and refused to breathe out again. The revelation was instant. The sound hadn't been caused by the steam line breaking. The steam line broke because I had written the scream, and the scream was amplified because Sterling needed the sonic atmosphere for his announcement. And Mr. Vance, the security guard? We heard the jingle of his keys drop onto the linoleum outside the door, followed by a heavy thud. Sterling's voice, now clearer, resumed over the PA, sounding satisfied. "Excellent acoustic atmosphere. Thank you for your contribution, Mr. Thorne." He knew I was listening. He had tailored the sound for my benefit. "The final announcement is now due," Sterling concluded, his voice fading slightly, the distortion returning. "The building requires its new history. Tomorrow, every remaining student in room 212 will write the final sentence of their shared narrative. We will document the complete and utter silence that replaces us." The broadcast ended with a flat, final click. We burst out of the choir room. Mr. Vance was lying on the floor, unconscious, his keys scattered beside him. He wasn't injured. He looked like he had simply collapsed from the auditory assault. I looked down the long, empty hallway, the fluorescent lights still humming, though with a different pitch now, a flatter, less energized drone. The smell of cold metal and old paper was overpowering. I had authored the school's physical scream. Sterling had used it to deliver his final requirement. The only way out of the paradox was through the final document. We were now forced to write the silence. I need to understand what happens to a structure when its narrative ends. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially not the ones where the school itself is the final victim. The final assignment was about documenting our own erasure, just like Peter Crowley had. The morning light filtering into the school felt weak and artificial, like a stage light left on after the audience has gone home. Mr. Vance was gone, presumably discovered and carted away, but the janitorial crew was unusually sparse, and the administrative staff seemed to move with a sluggish, confused lack of direction. It was as if the school's central operating system had been fundamentally destabilized by the collective weight of our written realities. The atmosphere wasn't tense. It was unnervingly subdued, a muted dread settling over everything. Liam was absent. I didn't blame him. He had seen the result of his joke about the flagpole finally materialize during the 7:45 a.m. safety inspection. The pole, deemed structurally sound just hours before, had spontaneously snapped mid-inspection, missing the principal's car only because it had been parked far away due to the previous day's warning. The core event, the snapping, had to occur, confirming Sterling's initial assertion that the facts were immutable. Only the timing could be shifted. When I entered room 212, there were only 6 of us left. The others had either dropped the class, moved districts overnight, or perhaps, like Peter Crowley, had found a way to write themselves out of the equation. But the remaining 6 of us, including Maria, who was now utterly silent and hollow-eyed, knew we were the unwilling authors of the school's final act. Mr. Sterling stood at the podium, surrounded by the ominous stacks of cream-colored parchment. He held his own essay, the final announcement, in his hand, tapping it gently against the wood. 6 authors remain, he observed, his voice holding a hint of tired satisfaction. The structure does not require many. It requires precision. He didn't hand out fresh paper. Instead, he presented us with a single, massive sheet of thick, dark gray vellum, a material far heavier and more permanent than the usual parchment. It was laid across the central demonstration desk. This is the collective final documentation, he stated. It requires a unified voice. You will each contribute one specific detail, a sensory observation about the ensuing silence. We are documenting the moment of zero narrative, the final compression. The requirement was clear. We had to collectively write the event that would end the school's story. What exactly is going to happen, Mr. Sterling? I asked, my voice steady despite the fear tightening my chest. Sterling finally laid down his own script. This building, he explained, tracing a finger across the vellum, is saturated with expectation. It vibrates with unfulfilled potential, the hope of the freshman, the dread of the senior, the forgotten dreams of the staff. When enough documented reality conflicts with the current timeline, the structure seeks release. It requires narrative closure. My announcement tonight, which will be broadcast precisely at the strike of midnight, will initiate the event. Your documentation will complete it. He was using the school's architectural and emotional mass as the realistic anchor, the building itself as the subject of the final history. The mythic element was the process of narrative closure, the school collapsing into silence. "You want us to document the silence after you've made your final announcement," I summarized. "Precisely. The consequence of the conclusion." We huddled around the desk. The vellum was cold and heavy, feeling like carved stone. Maria wrote first. Her hand shook violently as she dipped the pen into the dark, viscous ink Sterling provided. She wrote about sound. The absence of the janitor's squeaky cartwheels across the hallway's main axis. Alex, surprisingly, wrote about light. The fluorescent lights in the main stairwell will burn out simultaneously, not with a pop, but a slow, continuous fading to absolute blackness. They were documenting the details of the school's death, the small, specific absences that would confirm the conclusion. When it came to my turn, I hesitated. I had to write the final detail that would allow the tension to resolve, but I needed to preserve a thread of hope, an ambiguity that might allow me to survive the paradox. Peter Crowley had written his own absolute erasure. I couldn't afford that level of specificity. I remembered the clock in room 212, perpetually running backward. I had to focus on the structure's deep memory, its internal time loop. I wrote about texture and time. The dust motes, suspended in the single shaft of moonlight entering the main lobby, will suddenly reverse their descent, floating upward until they dissolve against the ceiling tiles. The ambient air temperature will drop instantaneously to the exact temperature of October 29th, 1987, the day the loop was first created. My goal was to document the building folding in on its own history, not its total destruction. If the school entered a perpetual loop, then its reality wouldn't be erased. It would simply be infinitely deferred. I looked up at Sterling. He didn't react to my entry, only nodding slowly. "Excellent. A return to the beginning. The loop closes." He then dipped his own pen into the ink. "And I shall document the frame." He wrote the opening sentence on the vellum, his hand swift and sure. At 12:01 a.m., November 7th, the memory of this structure will be expunged. Then, he pushed the vellum away and picked up his own manuscript, the final announcement. "The class ends tonight," he stated, looking at his remaining authors. "You have played your part beautifully. Now listen carefully." He explained that his final broadcast would contain an impossible linguistic trigger, a sentence designed to redefine the school's parameters instantly. It would force the reality drafted on the vellum to manifest. I looked at the clock above the door. 11:30 p.m. We had 30 minutes. I realized my mistake. I was so focused on documenting the ambient conditions of the silence that I hadn't accounted for the consequence of Sterling's action. If the school's memory was expunged, what did that mean for the people inside? "What happens to the authors, Mr. Sterling?" I asked, standing up. "To the people who wrote the new reality?" "You," he said, fixing me with a gaze of chilling indifference, "become the history you documented. You will be absorbed into the silence. You will be the dust motes reversing, the absence of the squeaky cart, the absolute lack of light. You become the definition of the building's new reality." My heart seized. I hadn't written a way out. I had merely defined my own erasure through time loop mechanics. I would become a ghost tethered to 1987's atmosphere. I lunged forward, grabbing at the vellum to scribble an amendment, a way out, a contradiction, but Sterling was too fast. He grabbed the vellum and stepped back, his physical movement surprisingly fluid for a man of his age. "The documentation is complete, Mr. Thorne. Any edits now would cause a paradoxical collapse, a chaotic end, rather than the peaceful, elegant silence we have designed." He smiled faintly, glancing at the clock. 11:45 p.m. "I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, Mr. Sterling, but perhaps one author can still rewrite the script. I knew the PA system was key. Sterling's broadcast was the initiating force. If I could destroy the PA system before midnight, I could prevent the expunging of the memory. I couldn't stop the inevitable silence, but I could stop the finality of his announcement. Sterling turned toward the door, holding the vellum and his essay like sacred texts. Midnight beckons. You may wait here and listen to your future, or you may try to escape. But understand this. Escape is merely another narrative, and this school only accepts one final, cohesive story. He walked out, leaving the six of us alone with the dark vellum, the silence already gathering in the corners of room 212. I had to reach the main PA relay, hidden in the basement supply closet, before he could speak his final, reality-bending sentence. The basement, the place I had already documented screaming, was my only anchor left. I didn't try to reason with the other 5 students. They were already defeated, paralyzed by the weight of the vellum document, already accepting their fate as the atmospheric details of the school's closure. I bolted from room 212, sprinting down the humming, deserted second-floor hallway, the sound of my sneakers loud and irreverent against the growing quiet. The path led straight to the stairwell that descended to the first floor and, beyond that, to the basement utility entrance near the boiler room, the precise location of the ruptured steam line I had authored just hours before. The air here already felt colder, laden with the metallic scent of dried steam and the heavy chill of 1987. As I ran, I noticed the architectural details of the school were starting to respond to the final draft. The school's clock, which had been reversing, now seemed frozen at 11:50 p.m. The long strip lights in the hall were duller, their hum more like a deep drone than a bright buzz, conserving energy for the final fade-out. I reached the basement stairwell. The door was usually locked with a magnetic keycard system, but tonight, it stood slightly ajar. Sterling wanted me to participate, even in failure. I descended into the basement. It was a labyrinth of echoing concrete, low ceilings, and massive, noisy machinery. The ambient reality anchor here was the boiler room, a space of extreme heat, loud mechanical churning, and thick, rusty steam pipes. Tonight, though, the machinery was strangely muted. The boiler was still running, but the massive burners only produced a low, rhythmic sigh. I reached the site of my predicted catastrophe, the main steam line. It was visibly damaged, a thin stream of vapor escaping from a jagged fissure, confirming the rupture. Yet, the sound was gone. The intense, human scream I had documented had served its purpose and vanished, leaving only the sound of gentle, rhythmic dripping water. I found the PA relay panel tucked into a small, dark closet right next to the boiler. It was a dense panel of labeled wires, fuses, and broadcasting equipment, illuminated by a single, weak bulb that cast long, distorting shadows. My hands were shaking as I faced the panel. I didn't know the complex wiring. I only knew I had to silence the broadcast. I needed to disrupt the flow of Sterling's reality-defining words before they reached the main speakers, especially the PA system that haunted this building. I glanced at my phone. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes. I grabbed the first thick cable I saw. A bundle wrapped in black insulation, clearly marked PA main, and pulled with all my strength. It was secured tightly. I tore at the housing, desperately searching for a weak point. Then, I heard it. The faint, dry crackle over the single PA speaker mounted above the boiler room entrance, the harbinger of Sterling's voice. Testing. Testing. 1, 2. Is this thing on? It was 11:59 p.m. I used the edge of a rusty pipe fitting I found on the floor and savagely wrenched the thick black cable from the wall. Sparks showered down, illuminating the dusty air, and the room was filled with a high, destructive pop. For a second, I thought I had failed. The broadcast might still travel through secondary lines. Then, at precisely midnight, the main speaker above the door crackled one last time, violently. Sterling's voice began to boom, cutting through the silence of the basement, rich with finality. At the stroke of midnight, the inhabitants of this structure will acknowledge that the history of Sterling High is now complete. The narrative must revert to zero, eliminating all contradictory. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of blue light emanated from the PA panel I had just assaulted. The power surge was overwhelming, and the voice cut out mid-word, mid-sentence, replaced by a sound that wasn't static or a scream, but a high, sustained, whistling tone, the sound of raw potential being contained and forced backward. I had silenced the broadcast, but the failure of his announcement didn't stop the final documentation from manifesting. The vellum essay, the collective reality we authored, was still locked into the timeline. I felt the basement drop in temperature instantaneously. It wasn't just cold, it was the specific, bone-deep dampness of late October, exactly as I had documented. The ambient air temperature will drop instantaneously to the exact temperature of October 29th, 1987. I looked up at the light bulb in the closet. It didn't burn out, it simply dimmed, its light draining away until the filament was visible but glowing a weak, dusty red, confirming Alex's written detail. I realized I hadn't prevented the closure. I had merely sabotaged Sterling's personal contribution to it, forcing the school to execute the remaining collective document imperfectly. I stumbled out of the boiler room and back into the main corridor. The air was thick with the scent of age. The low drone of the lights faded to a near silence. I rushed to the stairwell, climbing back up into the absolute stillness of the main school. When I reached the second floor, the hallway was profoundly, terrifyingly empty. I looked toward room 212. The door was open. Inside, the 5 remaining students were gone. Not physically gone, but absent. They had fulfilled their documented roles. Maria's absence of sound, Alex's lack of light. They were now the specific, negative details of the silence. I walked to the entrance of the main lobby. Above me, the single shaft of moonlight was piercing the ceiling windows. I stopped, watching the air. The dust motes will suddenly reverse their descent, floating upward until they dissolve against the ceiling tiles. And they did. Tiny, sparkling particles of dust, catching the weak moonlight, began to rise, slowly accelerating, until they vanished into the darkness above, sucked upward by the physics of a reversing timeline. I had documented the infinite loop, tethering the end to the beginning, 1987. I hadn't erased the school, but I had put it into perpetual narrative suspension. I looked around the empty, silent hall. The only thing left was the metallic smell of the parchment and the echo of a scream that wasn't quite a scream. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially not the ones that turn the student into the subject matter. I walked toward the main doors. I was the observer. I had fulfilled my role. I became the only remaining element of the new history, the one who walked away from the silence, forever bound to the secret of the written future. I stand outside the gates now, leaning against the cold, familiar brick wall, watching the dark silhouette of Sterling High. It is 12:30 a.m. The rain has stopped entirely, leaving the street wet and glistening under the distant, indifferent glow of a city street lamp. The school is silent, not the natural quiet of a sleeping institution, but an absolute, definitive absence of sound. There is no humming of ventilation, no buzz of distant lights, no rhythmic tick of the fire alarm system. The building has achieved the zero narrative state we wrote onto the vellum. I can still feel the profound chill of 1987 in the air, a specific, localized cold that doesn't belong to this season. And if I stare hard enough at the dark panes of the second-floor windows, sometimes I catch the briefest, faintest flicker, a ghost of the fluorescent lights trying and failing to ignite, conforming to the detail that they fade to absolute blackness. I am not the silence, and I am not the dust. I am the paradox, the survivor of a narrative that should have erased me. I documented the loop, and now I am forced to exist outside of it, carrying the knowledge of what happened to my